People who get involved in white supremacy always, always, always get cocky. They always do. They always do something that will lead to evidence existing in the public domain that allows us to track them down, to figure out who they are and hold them accountable. So, they may be having what feels like a long leash right now with the Trump presidency, enacting policies that they could only have dreamed of a few years ago, but we'll get them someday. We'll impose legal, social, and economic costs against them in accordance with the law, and we will have the popular support of the American people when we do that.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for checking out this episode of Hate Comes to Main Street. If you like what we're doing here, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. My guest in this episode is Kristofer Goldsmith. He's someone who knows so much about the threat of extremism in our country because he's been in the trenches now for several years. He's the head of a group called Task Force Butler. Take a look. Kristofer Goldsmith, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Phil. Great to be with you.
Let's start with, how did you decide this was your calling? This was something that you were compelled to do?
So it came to me because a friend of mine that I served in the Army with called me out of the blue. And he's done this a couple of times. Every few years, I won't hear from him, and then he'll give me a ring, and I'll have a life-changing phone call. And he called me in 2019 and told me, "Hey, Goldie, I just joined a neo-Nazi organization, and I want you to help me take him down." We had never discussed this topic before, and when he used the term neo-Nazi, I thought that he was exaggerating. This was, in the lead up to 2020 and the lead up to the stolen election stuff, we saw a lot of militia activity. I think the mainstream press was talking about the Oath Keepers, at least somewhat, prior to January 6th. They were absolutely on my radar as a veteran. I used to be a Ron Paul guy back in 2008, and it was out of the Ron Paul campaign that Stuart Rhodes started the Oath Keepers by recruiting veterans and police. So at that time, I was too busy and had to tell my friend, like, you need to pull out of this. I don't have time to even look into this. I was still in school. I was working full time. Then the pandemic hit, and I graduated and was laid off in the same week of May of 2020. And I went from having no time to all the time. So I called my buddy back up and I said, "All right, tell me about your Nazis." And again, I thought that he was using hyperbole when he described them that way. And it wasn't until I was infiltrating Patriot Front and logged into their rocket chat that I got to see from the inside that he wasn't using hyperbole, that they were discussing not just Hitler like I had seen Twitter trolls idolizing, symbols of hate. They were talking about fascist philosophy, and they were debating between fascism and totalitarianism and monarchy, and talking about their leader, Thomas Rousseau, then in his early 20s, as their Caesar, as their dictator, as their fascist leader that they hoped to see start a race war. So,
And, some people will say, people spout a lot of hot air, they're cosplaying. What's your answer to that when people say, just ignore them and they'll go away?
people who believe that if you ignore them, then they'll go away, should look at history and look at what unbridled and unopposed hate can do. Because it's not just Germany in the 1930s. Like this has happened several times throughout human history, where othering people has enabled not just the extremes like genocide, but things like Jim Crow laws in our own country, right? Hate and dehumanization of the other can cause mass human suffering, and it has happened here. It has that is part of the history of the United States. And we have not, as a nation, come to terms with it. Most Americans, myself included, until just a few years ago, didn't know that George Washington, our most famous founding father, spent much of his life hunting a formerly enslaved person that had escaped his grasp. That most Americans don't know that our first president abused his federal powers to hunt an escaped enslaved person named Ona Judge, right? This is the reality that we as a nation refuse to face. We refuse to have these tough conversations with our kids when we're teaching them about the history of our country, and that is denying us as a people, as a country, the opportunity to reckon with that past and truly learn from it.
Now, there will also be people watching this, especially in the area where I live, who say, "Well, you're part of Antifa. You're part of the problem." And
Yeah.
what is your answer to them?
I am a proud anti-fascist, and I follow in the footsteps of every man in my grandfather's generation in my family who deployed during World War II to fight fascists. My One of the greatest influences in my young life was my grandmother. She lived 2 houses down, 100 yards away, and in her home was a letter from President Eisenhower written to her mother about her older brother who died fighting Nazis in Europe. The letter said that he died in the European theater, right? He died in a time of so much chaos fighting fascism that they didn't say what city or even what country he was killed in. I don't think I will ever know that. So I am a very proud anti-fascist. But I do take issue with the idea that people use the phrase member of Antifa. There is no Antifa organization. Now, I run an organization called Veterans Fighting Fascism, and Veterans Fighting Fascism, as the name very clearly implies, is an anti-fascist organization. But people should be disabused of the idea that there is some overwhelming, shadowy Antifa organization. If there was an Antifa organization like that, I again would be a proud member, because if you're not anti-fascist and you're either fascist or you're just okay with fascists. I'd prefer to follow in the footsteps of my forefathers who fought fascism.
So you got inside Patriot Front.
Mhm.
How deep did you get, and how quickly did your attitude change from what you initially thought based on your friends' conversations to what you saw on the inside?
So this was a unique time, right? I went from at Columbia University, a full-time student, working a full-time job that was in Washington, D.C., and running my own nonprofit, all of which shut down because of the pandemic. So I had been used to a lot of stimulation, a lot of work. And then all of a sudden it was all gone. So I spent countless hours absorbing information, coming to understand the way that Patriot Front operates. It kind of operates like a pyramid scheme. Every member has to buy stickers and stuff from their leader, Thomas Rousseau. That is what enables him to have never had an actual job. He lives off of his members. And the district leaders, basically the local leaders, are involved in this pyramid scheme, right? And it all goes up to Thomas.
And which, by the way, is how the KKK in the 1920s operated as well.
Precisely, yeah. And Rousseau comes from Texas. He has deep ties with the Aryan Brotherhood, with KKK members. He's got mentors who've been involved in professionalized Nazism and white supremacism for decades and decades. It is a multi-generational thing that has been passed on. So I I was entirely virtually infiltrating Patriot Front, whereas my friend, who was my alter ego, basically this guy that I served with, he was Gabriel, CA, Gabriel, California. Everyone in Patriot Front is assigned or picks their own nickname, basically, and then they get the designator for whatever state they're in. So now they call him Bad Gabriel because there was multiple Gabriels throughout the organization, and Gabriel was one of the scariest human beings I have ever met from my time in the Army. He was a combatives instructor, and that is part of why Patriot Front loved him so much. He was not just a combat veteran, but he was someone who studied martial arts, mixed martial arts, and the way that he kept himself sane while hanging out with these neo-Nazis and pretending to be a hate-filled, violent Nazi is that he would train them to fight. And the fragile masculinity within Patriot Front is like the defining characteristic of every member. And Gabriel told them that the only way to learn to fight is to lose. So he would beat the shit out of all of these Nazis all the time. And yeah, I don't know how many of them remember that. I imagine that there were a lot of concussions, but they loved it because that reinforced their perception of them being masculine, getting punched in the face by my friend.
And what are they training for specifically?
People think that, like I thought my buddy Gabriel was using hyperbole, they think that we're exaggerating, but their desire is for collapse of our government and a race war where they act as the foot soldiers to enforce a new racial hierarchy here in the United States. Now that sounds fantastical to a lot of people, but we live in a country that now has concentration camps. It now has a secret police force. I think 4 years ago, 10 years ago, you would have thought that I was insane if I told you that in the year of 2025 or 2026 that the United States would have a secret masked police force that was kidnapping people in unmarked vehicles and sending them off to a camp in the Everglades called Alligator Alcatraz, right? That sounds like a crazy, insane theory,
right?
Conspiracy theory, but that's the reality that we live in today. I mean, the Alligator Alcatraz has been shut down by a judge, but that did exist until a judge shut it down, and that was our government doing it. So
at what point did Patriot Front think they would be fully activated?
So I had infiltrated them in 2020. Again, a unique time. It was the first year of the COVID pandemic, when many, many, many Americans, if not the vast majority of Americans, were scared for their lives for a year straight, right? And people were dying. I live in New York. There were trucks filled with bodies, not far from me. So Patriot Front was looking at the then 2020 election, and there had already been this stolen election theme. There had already been this, like, Donald Trump can't win but for cheating, right? The seeds had been planted for Stop the Steal for years prior to the activation on election day of 2020. So when I infiltrated that organization, I did it purposefully to expose them. And I was working with a journalist then at BuzzFeed. And the deal was that I made with that journalist that they would have unfettered access to everything that I had access to, so long as they published their story prior to the election. Rousseau, the leader of this organization, does not trust his lieutenants, let alone his foot soldiers, his members. So he doesn't tell them where they're going when they're doing one of their, U-Haul Nazi marches, right? They basically, a few of the lieutenants will find out last minute where they're going. They'll have to organize flights or carpools to drive across the country or fly across the country and end up at whatever, campsite that they choose, which many of them don't know where they are when they're physically there. Many of them don't know where they're going when they enter the back of a U-Haul, right? So we didn't know, because we were me and Gabriel, were the foot soldiers, but we knew that they had some sort of plan. Now, it wasn't enough to expose them because Patriot Front loves getting coverage. Anything that makes them look nefarious or scary, that increases their recruiting. What I had to do was embarrass them. So when the BuzzFeed article went live and they started celebrating it, being like, oh my God, this is like the biggest coverage that we've ever gotten. And I think it might have been BuzzFeed's biggest coverage, biggest article of the year, 2020. I started live tweeting their discussions internally from Rocket Chat, which is their internal communications platform. They then went dark for a couple months, and though a couple members did participate in the January 6th insurrection, the organization itself didn't appear to mobilize until months after. So I don't know what they were planning. I don't know what they might have had in mind for election night or for January 6th or any time soon after. But I do think that Gabriel and I sullied their plans.
What did you learn inside Patriot Front that I would not know today, observing them from the outside? What special insight did this infiltration give you?
Uh, well, you are a special case. The people watching this might not know this, but the average white supremacist isn't just some like loser in a basement. They're not just some social outcast or some poor rural person with a lack of education. The white supremacists in this country include people with advanced degrees. One who led the Virginia chapter was an engineer. He was employed as an engineer, had advanced degrees. There were, students, active members of Patriot Front who were students at top universities all around the country. And that is still the case. People have started to, I guess, make white supremacists less scary in their own minds, not purposefully, but they think so little of white supremacists that they're nothing like me. But a lot of these members of Patriot Fronts, they do own businesses. They are successful. They come from families with a lot of money. They do have a lot of resources. Yes, there are some losers. Yes, there are some runts, and there are some people who live out in a rural place and have no education. But the average member of Patriot Front looks like the average young white man.
And you or your group have also done other infiltrations, and in a group that's especially top of mind for me these days is, excuse me, the active clubs.
Mhm.
Have you or members of your team done active club infiltrations, and what have you learned from that?
So members of my team have not gotten involved with active clubs. Part of that is a resource issue. I mean, it's not an efficient use of undercover resources because active clubs are so sloppy. They are very closely related to Patriot Front. There is a lot of membership overlap. But active clubs, everything you want to know about an active club, they post on Telegram. So most of our intelligence collection related to them is just simply collected from open source intelligence, regular open source intelligence methods. We have no need to infiltrate them.
What do you see as the most significant infiltration your team has done? You or your team?
It was definitely the Patriot Front one. I had been involved in multiple infiltrations of Patriot Front in partnership with my buddy Gabriel. That was definitely the longest, most in-depth, most resource intensive. Infiltrations of like the 3%ers, Oath Keepers, they don't require as much attention. They don't require as much backstory, and that's the kind of like taxing thing of like having to remember what you told them and like truly being undercover. The the Patriot Front, the militias that we have infiltrated are um, generally tend to the average member tends to be a little bit older and they're not as tech savvy. So it's much easier for us to build and maintain a false persona.
What difference have your infiltrations made?
The so the goal of Task Force Butler Institute, which is the small training organization where we train veterans in open source intelligence research, is to make it difficult and expensive to impose legal, social, and economic costs on these neo-Nazis, these fascists, these hate mongers. The most significant change that we have made is we have made them far more paranoid than they had been in the past. I haven't done an active infiltration personally. I haven't done an active infiltration in, I don't know, well over 2 years at this point, and I still get notifications from my friends who are actively infiltrating other organizations where they'll be like, the the NSC 131, I think, did it, or maybe it was Blood Tribe, somewhat recently, like posted a whole like expose on Telegram about how they found Chris Goldsmith as he was trying to infiltrate. So they're accusing basically any white bearded bald guy with tattoos of being Chris Goldsmith. So they are losing prospective members because they just think everybody who looks like me is me. And that might sound like a funny little anecdote, but it's not. When we showed up at the Aryan Freedom Network's White Unity Conference and we flew a drone over their conference, they spent years literally looking up at the skies, like literally wondering where the Antifa Air Force is. Being able to use up their resources, including their time, their attention, and their energy that way, prevents them from being able to use that time, attention, and energy to hurt people. Their objectives is to cause fear and cause paranoia among, specific targeted populations, but more broadly against the American public. And we're returning that favor, doing that to them, sapping them of the resources that they would otherwise use to cause harm.
What have you learned about why young men are drawn to these groups, and what can we do to make it less attractive to these young men?
So prior to any of my research, just growing up as a young man, and experiencing, feeling hate. I joined the Army in 2003. I'm a New Yorker. I was 16 when the towers fell, right? I was what I now recognize as Islamophobic, as racist. I didn't identify that way, but those were the thoughts and feelings that I had. I was, part of the libertarian movement in 2007, 2008, primarily because I had grown up in a very conservative world in the U.S. military, and the only anti-war version of conservatism that I knew of was libertarianism. And I got to see, how people took that ideology and went off into the fringes with like sovereign citizenship and all of the conspiracy theories that surround that type of lifestyle, white supremacy and other forms of hate included. So I think that there are many things that lead young white men to become white supremacists, but among them are things like jokes. We've all seen, over the last, I don't know how many years, last 20 years, not just conservative leaning comedians, but conservative politicians and people saying like, oh, you can't say XYZ anymore, people get upset. Like, you can't be openly racist or people get upset is what they're saying, right? People start making racist jokes on like video game platforms, and this happens in real life too. It's not just video games. I don't want people to think that Discord is the only place people get radicalized, but on Discord, people will prompt young kids to say racist things, and they may not believe it, but they'll think like, "Oh, this is extreme, and I'm getting a thrill out of breaking the rules." And over time, young men, young boys, or anyone, they start to internalize the jokes. They start to internalize the hateful rhetoric. They start to double down, especially when there's online anonymity attached to it, where there's no cost to saying or doing something racist. And these provocations that they make, they get a reward. Their brain sends them chemicals, the reward chemicals, every time they see someone else get upset. And they kind of get addicted to the dopamine that results from triggering someone. So it starts off as this joke, as this idea that they want to be edgy because they get off on it. And then they just kind of start to believe the hateful rhetoric that they were otherwise just saying to get a rise out of people.
So, how do we keep young white men from being pulled into this? How do we pull them out?
Community is I think it sounds like a cop out, right? Because it's such a broad answer, but things like team sports, and I was in the Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts growing up. There were a lot more third places when I was growing up than there is today. Like, me and my friends used to go to the bowling alley all the time, or the pool hall, like well before the pool hall was associated with me. Now, like going to a bar, we used to go out and have fun. Today's kids don't have those places anymore. They have these online spaces that are difficult, if not impossible, for parents or guardians or older brothers or sisters to monitor. And I don't think that people should necessarily try to monitor everything that kids do online. But community and family are it. You know, when kids are loners, when they feel alone, when they feel unsafe, when they feel vulnerable, they are vulnerable and they can be taken advantage of.
When you look at the current threat landscape, I've been watching, for example, the riots in Northern Ireland, and I find great reason to be concerned about that. Do you share that concern, and what does that say about the threat here in the States?
So in the United States, we have a protest season in the same way that in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had fighting seasons, right? And anyone in the last 20 years who deployed to Afghanistan knows, like, in the spring comes the fighting. That's when you look historically, that's when the injuries and the deaths kind of pile up. The reason is no one likes to fight in the snow. No one likes to protest in the snow, right? So the weather's warm. We are in the summer months. We are in fighting season. Colleges just they're done with finals. Graduation has happened, or people are on their way to their break before they go back to school in September. We're in the fighting season now. I expect this summer to be a hot summer, not to the level that the 2020 uprisings were around Black Lives Matter and police murders, police violence. But I do expect there to be mass oppositions to things like Delaney Hall, where there is horrific treatment of immigrants, of undocumented people, of activists, citizens who are on the ground there to express their First Amendment rights. So I think that, looking at the race riots that are happening in Europe right now, that is something that domestic white supremacists are hoping happens here. And we're going to see intentional provocations over the summer. Right now, we've got the World Cup games, which is bringing not very many, but some tourists from overseas. We've got, that puts, these representations of nations into defined spaces. So we are going to see more provocations like the burning cross from the last couple of days or last week. Those types of events are going to happen more and more. We live in a country where there's more mass shootings than days. Like, this is an increasing problem here in the United States. We're very likely to see white supremacist motivated mass violence like that. This is the World Cup, 76 games in the United States over the course of something like 5 weeks, all across the United States. That's an incredible amount of public events, of soft targets for all sorts of threat actors, both related to Iran and everything that the United States is doing in the Middle East, the cartels that we've been at war with throughout all of Latin America, and domestic white supremacists who want to exploit those foreign conflicts and bring them home to create an idea that we are being attacked by the other, to hopefully radicalize more white Americans into a belief that we white people need to engage in fascist and authoritarian politics.
And as I have seen through my own research in the last few days, I mean, we have active club groups, the head of the active club, Robert Rundo's network, actually studying how the rioters in Belfast are evading detection. So
Mhm.
that cannot be a good warning sign.
Yeah, it's it. I mean, it's blatant. I read your piece and thank you for sending it, where they're talking about like, oh, this is purely academic study, figuring out how these people are getting away with violence against other people, citizens and civilians, and against police. But we all know that that's tongue in cheek. And for any one of them that might be watching this video, like, that doesn't hold up well in court. Like, that gets used as evidence of evidence of intent. So you're not protecting anyone. You might as well just be clear about it. Robert Rundo has had a tremendous impact on organized white supremacy globally. He is the father of the concept of the active club, and he has been quite successful in creating a model for young white supremacists to engage in terroristic violence and property destruction and threats without consequence. The FBI has been gutted of its specialists, its agents who specialize in combating domestic white supremacy, the greatest threat to the homeland and our collective national security. But the FBI isn't the only group out there, right? My organization, Task Force Butler Institute, exists for a reason, because the FBI that we had, under Joe Biden's presidency wasn't going after white supremacists either. So we will, and people like me, we have our own decentralized network of researchers, documentarians who are collecting evidence, and we will make sure to hold these people accountable. People who get involved in white supremacy always, always, always get cocky. They always do. They always do something that will lead to evidence existing in the public domain that allows us to track them down, to figure out who they are and hold them accountable. So, they may be having what feels like a long leash right now with the Trump presidency, enacting policies that they could only have dreamed of a few years ago. But we'll get them someday. We'll impose legal, social, and economic costs against them in accordance with the law, and we will have the popular support of the American people when we do that.
Let me ask you one more quick question about Robert Rundo and his active club network. They sponsor these periodic fights around the country. the forest fights. I think they're called the frontier fights.
Mhm.
What, why should people care about that aspect of the active club slash patriot movements?
Yeah, so what makes Robert Rundo particularly dangerous is that he has inspired a movement of thousands of young men around the country to get more physically violent. And let's be very clear about what we're talking about here. Now, our country, and certainly under Joe Biden, we don't like to use the term terrorism to describe anything that a white person ever does. But the definition of terrorism is the use of violence or the threat of force to coerce or intimidate a population or a government into doing something to abide by your political will, right? That is what terrorism is. So Robert Rundo has inspired a terrorist organization. The point of active clubs is to teach young men how to do a massive amount of physical damage to another person in the shortest amount of time possible. That is the point of mixed martial arts, right? They are not doing it as a friendly competition. They are doing it in hopes of the opportunity to cause harm to other people that way on the streets of the United States. So these frontier fights, these competitions that they do with Patriot Front, they aren't just exhibitions. They are physically training, as we do in the military, to be able to not just physically but mentally and emotionally cause physical harm to another human being. In the military, post World War II, after D-Day, the military learned that human beings have an inherent aversion to targeting another human being. Prior to World War II, we used to shoot at circular targets, like shaped like a bullseye, right? After D-Day, after they figured out that something like 15 or 17% of those who actually hit the beach ever fired their weapons, they realized that there was a massive aversion that was preventing trained soldiers from pulling the trigger and taking the life of another because they had never pointed their weapon at a human being before. It is far, far, far easier for a white supremacist to go and to punch someone in the face, to hit someone with a baseball bat, if they've spent a few months punching their friend in the face for practice. It's not just about the physical training, it's the psychological ability, the emotional ability to put aside your humanity and to dehumanize the target and to cause physical violence.
Last question, and I know we've barely scratched the surface, but I hear from a lot of people saying, yeah, the material you're covering is such a downer. It's so depressing. And what can I do about it? What is your answer? What can the average person do to respond to this moment?
So Task Force Butler Institute and we have gotten thousands of messages from people across the United States who have asked exactly that question. And we wrote a couple of instruction manuals available for free. If you go to taskforcebutler.org, there is the street team guide for people who are usually younger, more energetic, who are perhaps experienced in activism. The street team's guide is tells people how to gather evidence. Like if they know that Patriot Front is going to show up, because there's a ton of infiltrators in these organizations all the time. These informal networks of anti-fascists, tweet the location of upcoming white supremacist events all the time, right? So if there are on the ground activists who already have a group that they're working with, the street team's guide is for them. For everyone else, for the vast majority of people, we have the community response guide. We literally wrote this for the grandmas who kept writing us emails asking how they could punch a Nazi in the face. We do not encourage any grandmas to punch anybody in the face, right? We abhor violence. But The community response guide helps you get started in gathering evidence of criminality, of criminal intent, and of identifying factors. Right? We in our instruction manual we explain things like we all have a tendency to turn on the video and hold our phone like this. Well, photographs like this, taken still photos, gather much greater detail. Members of Patriot Front, to the untrained eye, may look identical. They don't wear the same pants. They don't wear the same boots. They don't wear the same shirts. They all have their own patches. They all have like a waiter at Fridays. They have their own flair, and they all wear the same thing at every event that they go to. So if you take some photos of their TGI Fridays flair, you can figure out, who they are in Texas. Well, you've identified them in Boston. Now you can connect them to a crime, right? And we have done that several times over, and it's cost them millions of dollars. So for folks who want to get started, go to taskforcebutler.org. There's the instruction manuals. For people who want to learn how to organize and to start working with a group, go to veteransfightingfascism.org. We have our guide for the anti-fascist book club. It's not just to better understand fascism and fascists. It's the Anti-Fascist Book Club is a manual that will help you and a group of like-minded people. They don't have to be your friends right away, but they will become your friends. Get together and have something concrete to do. We give you a guidance for the first few books and the first 6 sessions. After that, you don't need Chris Goldsmith. You don't need Veterans Fighting Fascism. You don't need Task Force Butler. You've got your own independent anti-fascist organization that you can prioritize what you want, get involved in local politics, and impose social, legal, and economic costs in accordance with the law against your local neo-Nazis.
Well, Chris, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insight. And sadly, it's probably not going to be the last time we have this conversation.
Well, thank you, Phil. I really respect your reporting. So glad to see what you're doing on Substack. It's awesome to see you doing your great work here. So thank you.
Thank you. Be well, my friend.
You too.